A reading from the Gospel of John. I am the true vine, and my Father is the vine grower. He removes every branch in me that bears no fruit. Every branch that bears fruit, he prunes to make it bear more fruit. You have already been cleansed by the word that I have spoken to you. Abide in me as I abide in you. Just as the branch cannot bear fruit by itself unless it abides in the vine, neither can you unless you abide in me. I am the vine, you are the branches. Those who abide in me and I in them bear much fruit, because apart from me you can do nothing. Whoever does not abide in me is thrown away like a branch and withers. Such branches are gathered, thrown into the fire, and burned. If you abide in me, and my words abide in you, ask for whatever you wish, and it will be done for you. My Father is glorified by this, that you bear much fruit and become my disciples. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
I have loved many plants to death. I have overwatered, underfed, overpruned, and generally overtended more plants than I can count. So I had a great laugh today when I read that the text was about a vine and a gardener. I don't know gardening, but I do know what it feels like to wither. I don't know what to prune, but I am learning every day that there is always more room at the table. I am definitely not a gardener, but I will admit that I know what it's like to try to carry the weight of both the vine and the branches alone, like a good bootstrapping American with rugged individualism. And when I remembered these things about myself, I realized that this text deserved a second look instead of being thrown out like last year's rotten annuals. In my irreverent imagination, I see this picture in John 15 as a scene playing out like an ongoing game of charades between Jesus and his disciples. Jesus introduces his turn. One word, noun. Then his attempt to mimic his role is met with inquisitive looks from the disciples, to which an exasperated Jesus cries, "I'm a vine, the true vine." Charades aside, this scene is a part of a series where Jesus spent time telling us who he is. We hear earlier in the book of John more about the identity of Jesus. He is true light. He is the bread of life. And in this moment, in John 15, he reveals himself as the vine that will keep us connected to the source of life and to one another. Then just after Jesus reveals himself as the vine, the life source to the branches, he gives a rather challenging image of what is involved in the upkeep of the vine. The pruning, the tending, the sparsing out of withered branches. All of this makes sense in the upkeep of a vine, a living thing that simply cannot be overwhelmed by wayward branches, by overzealous fruit, by branches intent on going their own way and finding their own sustenance. In the first mention of pruning, it all makes sense. It seems like an act of great care for the vine that needs to stay alive. Yes, please, keep the vine alive. Do whatever you need to do. If that's you, you are the vine. We need you. And then Jesus throws us for a loop and brings the disciples into the story. I am the vine. You are the branches. Oh. Suddenly, pruning doesn't sound so necessary. Now, before we jump to the verse about throwing the branches away as an act that can so easily seem punitive, let's pause for a moment on a word that permeates this text: abide. Abide in me as I abide in you. What a gorgeous image of relationship, of dependence, of deep, deep care. We hear this word throughout this story in the midst of pruning and tearing away and throwing old branches into the fire. We hear a constant refrain: abide, 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 abide. And if we let it, it can begin to sound like a heartbeat. The heartbeat that might keep the vine alive. Abide, abide, abide. This begins to paint a picture of this scene of pruning at the vineyard that is less punitive and more demonstrative of a radical, welcoming love. The love that we know in the living Christ. In the ongoing refrain of the word abide, we hear a call to stay near to Jesus and to one another. In my search for what in the world one does with a plant, I did some reading on pruning, and pruning makes room for new life, but it also keeps the plant nearer to the source of life. And perhaps that is what it looks like to abide, to stay near to what brings you life. This past year, many of us have been reaching, searching, yearning for sources of life, especially while we have been apart physically. I'm reminded of a few stories of ways that in the midst of a global pandemic that nearly made us all wither, that we found ways to stay near to the source of life and to one another. My dear friend Wayne is a gifted musician in Atlanta. And at the beginning of the pandemic, when it was clear that the quarantine was going to be more than just a few days or even a few weeks of what felt like snow days at the beginning, Wayne began making recordings of 2-minute piano songs from his home and posting them on Facebook. And what started as something fun and life-giving for Wayne became a source of connection for his network and his church community, who were suddenly separated by distance. As a musician, Wayne knows that music, for many people, is a source of life and a way to worship the living Christ. When I asked him this week what compelled him to post those recordings, he said he did it because he knew all concerts had been canceled and that people still needed music. He expressed that it helped him feel near to the people he loved. Perhaps he knew that it helped him to abide. It helped him to feel like he still mattered. There have been other echoes of what it means to stay near, to abide. A nurse working in a COVID unit did not want to risk carrying the illness home to her husband and preschool-aged daughter, so they asked the community for help finding an RV to keep in their driveway so that she could still be near the ones she loved when she returned home from work, caring for the deeply sick patients at the hospital. Her community showed up, and she was able to spend time to be near to her family while staying in an RV in her driveway in the midst of this global pandemic that was swirling around us as she cared for these patients. There are chaplains among us who perhaps have a new definition of what it means to be near, to abide. They have spent this year connecting grieving family members with sick loved ones using screens. They have prayed through layers of masks and PPE, and yet they have remained near to those who are hurting. We have seen activism continue throughout this year, showing us once again that one voice alone is likely to wither after a while, but voices together, connected to the source of life, committed to abiding in love, can make change. May we remember when we chant, march, and pray that if we for 1 second try to do this work alone or for our own agendas, we will surely wither. I am reminded of a quote by activist Lilla Watson: "If you have come here to help me, you are wasting your time. But if you have come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together." In our work, friends, may we always remember that we are connected to the same source of life, to the same vine. It can feel so easy to want to go our own way, to have our own agendas, to feed our own souls. Sometimes it's just easier to give ourselves what we need because it's quicker that way, and we're less likely to get hurt. We're also more likely to wither that way, to forget who we really are as beloveds of God, as disciples of the living Christ, as branches of the vine. And while it is so easy to see this text as a dire warning today, branches being cut off and thrown into the fire, today instead I read it as an invitation to abide, to stay near, to stay near to the source of life. Stay with me, I hear Jesus say. We can hear that phrase in many scenarios. A mother reaching out her hand to a toddler running ahead to cross the street. Stay with me. A paramedic desperately trying to keep someone alive with the pumps of the chest. Stay with me. Stay with me. A child asking a parent to read one more story at bedtime. Stay with me. Stay near. All of these moments point back to a source of life, a way to abide. And then Jesus turns the source of life into a relationship, into a community. Abide in me, and I will abide in you. It's as if he's saying, we're in this together. I took the long way to work this week, and walked an extra lap around the Wilshire building to try to understand the plants. I had a great chat with the master gardener, Claudia Barner, about some of the flora and fauna around Wilshire's property. I don't think I'll ever be a master gardener, but I am learning what it means to abide. I also noticed on my walk around the building that part of this text is inscribed on the very bricks outside of McKeever Chapel. The history of this church tells me that you know what it means to abide in the living Christ, to care deeply for one another so that no one withers, to make room for everyone to flourish. And yet, as we come to the end of one of the most difficult years, a year of global pandemic, we remember that we can't survive alone. We know that now. Many of us have tried to survive alone. Many of us will continue to try to survive alone. But what if today we answer the invitation to abide, to stay near to the source of life and the living Christ? What if we heard ringing in every joy, every sorrow, every cry, every doubt, the familiar refrain, abide, abide, abide? As the daughter of a longtime music minister, I'm reminded of the hymn, Abide With Me, by Henry Francis Light. You might know it. Abide with me, fast falls the eventide, the darkness deepens, Lord, with me abide. When other helpers fail and comforts flee, help of the helpless, oh, abide with me. This is a plea from the singer to God, the source of life, to abide throughout our life, throughout our trials, our darkness, light, joy, and pain. But like the text today, I began to hear this song differently for a moment, especially the last line. I began to hear this as an invitation from Jesus to us. Abide in me, and I will abide in you. Abide, abide, abide. Stay near. Can you hear the invitation? In life, in death, will you abide with me? Amen.